Hello, this is David Panush of the Edmund Burke School, and this is a video lecture for your review from Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert. This is chapter 10 in the section Corrigibility, and the title of the chapter is Once Bitten. So, we've spent a lot of time in this book talking about how we don't always make ourselves happy. And the last part of the book is about how we should be able to use our practice, trying to get better at something, or coaching, somebody helping us get better at something, in order to be happier in the future. So those are the two ways that Daniel Gilbert talks about that we can learn from the past in order to be happy. So this is in theory. Practice, learn by doing something. Coaching, learn by being told what to do. So the learning in this case is learn how to make yourself happier, learn how to make better choices. So this chapter looks at learning through practice. So in theory, again, I do something, I am more or less successful at it, I reflect on what went wrong, and then I do it again, this time without the oops, as Jeff Goldblum's character says to Will Smith's character in Independence Day. So in order for us to make good choices about what will make us happy, we need to be aware of our emotions in the moment, remember them accurately, and then make different choices. So, we just go back to the last slide. I got to know what I did wrong in order to do it better the second time. But we've been studying being aware of our emotions in the moment, not something we're very good at. And memory, accurate memory, especially when it comes to emotions, once again, not something we're very good at. So it should not surprise us that even though we should be able to learn from our mistakes, we often do not. So there are three ways in which we talk about how our memories fail us when we talk about thinking about making predictions about future events. So the first is unusual events. So anything that is unusual or infrequent comes more to mind more easily. And anything that we can think of more easily, we then believe happens more frequently than it really does. So this, in some ways, kind of relates to the idea we talked about in the last chapter about explanations and things that we can explain. We stop thinking about them. We think they're mundane. Similarly, if we can't come up with something, we think, oh, that's odd, then we tend to believe it's more frequent and more predictable than it really is. And the flip side is, even though the bulk of the events that go on are actual typical events, usual events, mundane events, because they actually don't come to mind as easily as unusual events, we predict that they are less frequent than they really are. So one of the experiments that Gilbert talks about in the book is they asked one group of people, remember a time you missed your train. Then they asked a separate group of people to remember the worst time you missed your train. And both groups remembered the same memory. So in other words, if I just say, come up with a time you missed your train, you don't think of all the times you missed your train but it was no big deal. You think of the worst time when you missed your train. So in other words, we jump to the most unusual event and we think that that's a typical event when in fact it is not typical. So we overestimate the highs, we overestimate the lows, and we underestimate the moderate or normal typical experiences that happen every day. The second idea that Gilbert talks about in this chapter is that endings matter more. So when we remember an experience, we tend to, we've talked about this from the very beginning of the book, we tend to reweave it and put it back together. Well, the ending tends to take on a huge piece of the reweaving, more than it should, so to speak. So again, this comes back to our awareness. We're not paying enough attention to the experience as it's happening. But the last thing of that experience sticks in our head, and we go back and somebody says, what was that experience like? Well, the last thing in your head was the ending. So you kind of end up contracting the whole experience into the ending. So Gilbert talks about a movie that he saw called Schindler's List, probably before your time a little bit, but a wonderful movie, Oscar-winning movie. And he talks about how he didn't remember liking it because he hated the ending. And he doesn't remember why he doesn't like it. But he learns later, he goes back and watches it again. He's like watching it, he's like, oh, what an amazing movie. Gets to the end, this terrible ending that he doesn't like. He says, that's why I don't remember liking this movie. Even though the rest of the movie, 99% of the movie, minute by minute, he's having happiness watching it. He doesn't like the ending, it ruins the whole thing for him in terms of his memory of the experience. A couple other experiments referenced in this section of the book. Folks put their hands in ice water for 60 seconds. Another group puts their hand in ice water for 60 seconds, but then the water gets warmer moderately for 30 seconds. And then they ask folks, which experience would you like to repeat? And people actually say they'd repeat the longer experiments where they actually have their hand in ice water for a full 90 seconds because relatively they felt better in those last 30 seconds than the first 60 seconds, even though you have the first 60 seconds are exactly the same. They're both terrible or uncomfortable, and they pick the one with the longer exposure to ice water because it has a better ending. And you ask people to predict. People would predict the opposite, but they're wrong, which of course is why we end up making these sorts of mistakes. Similar experiment he talks about where you tell people about two different women's lives. One group rates one woman's life and another group rates another woman's life. And one woman lived a pretty good life until she was 60, died in a car accident. Another woman lived a pretty good life until she was 60, had 5 years where she really didn't have a very good life, and then died. And people rate the woman who died at 60 as having a better life than the woman who died at 65, even though she lived 5 years longer. Okay, but this is when they give them to them separately. Interestingly, if they put the two lines together, and then you show the one life ending at 60 and the other life ending at 65, then the discrepancy in the rating of the lives goes away. But all this goes to show, because we reweave memories, the ending has an overly large influence over how we think about an experience that we've had, and may lead us to make a poor choice in the future. Finally, and this one can really blow your mind, I think, whatever our theories or society's theories and assumptions are, or our expectations are about how you should feel, or how a certain group of people should feel in a certain experience, that biases us to remember the experience that way, even if it wasn't that way while we were having it. And I'll show you an example in a second. So in other words, we think that people should be happy doing something. We test those people, and they're actually not particularly happy. And then we test their memories of their experience, and their memories match up with what they think they should be rather than what they actually experience. So we rewrite our memories based off of our theories and expectations of how people should feel. And again, the reality is not as high or as low as we would probably think. It's more moderate. And it's less biased. People are actually less biased in the moment by these things than their memories of it are. So here's an example from the book. So they asked likely Gore voters and likely Bush voters in the 2000 election, how happy will you be? I think they asked Gore voters and they flipped it. How happy would you be the day after a Bush victory? And so obviously you can see the first section there, that the Gore voters thought they'd be pretty unhappy, and the Bush voters thought they'd be really happy. And then, after the victory was determined by the U.S. Supreme Court, however that was determined, they actually asked people, how happy are you or how sad are you? And you can see people rated Bush voters were happy, not as happy as they predicted, and Gore voters were unhappy, not as unhappy as they predicted, just like in our football game experiment from earlier in the book. Because of all the mundane, normal, other stuff that's going on in your life, you're not nearly as affected by this thing as you thought you would be. But then, here's the blowing the mind part. They asked them 4 months later, How happy were you when you heard that Bush won? And the Bush voters remember being really happy, and the Gore voters remember being really unhappy. So you can see that the prediction, in other words, our theory about how happy or sad we'd be, matches our memory of how we thought we'd be, as opposed to our actual experience. So was it real? I mean, does December 14th even matter? Would you rather have a good memory of an experience, or would you rather have a good experience? I don't know. But if your mind is not a little bit tweaked by all this stuff, then you should come and see me, and I'll try and confuse you some more. All right, so to sum up, our memory of emotional episodes is overly influenced by unusual instances, closing moments, and theories about how we must have felt way back then, all of which gravely compromises our ability to learn from our own experience. Because remember, we started this chapter saying we should be able to make ourselves happier in the future by learning from our mistakes, except that requires you, in terms of your emotions, in terms of your happiness, to be aware of your emotions and to remember them correctly. But if something unusual has happened, that throws us off. If the ending was really different than the experience, that throws us off. And if our expectation about how we were supposed to feel or how we thought we would feel is different from the reality, then our memory just erases that to some degree. So all of this makes it very difficult for us to learn from our mistakes. As usual, this is not a substitute for reading. Please read, please find some good quotes and learn this stuff, and do your homework, and come and see me if you have questions.